Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Lucinda Vakura. I use pronouns she, her. I'm the Vice President of Business Development and Marketing with Alford Group. And I have short hair, I'm wearing a maroon top, and I'm sitting against a plant and a bookcase behind me. Thank you so much for being here. Today's event is titled Giving USA 2025, Philanthropy in Uncertain Times. Before we dive in, I want to tell you a little bit about Alford Group and walk you through some webinar logistics, and then I'll turn things over to our moderator. Alford Group, I realize many of you, maybe most of you are familiar with who we are, but in case you may not be, Alford Group is a national full-service consultancy serving the nonprofit sector. We offer 5 flagship services that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. We are proud to be a member and a sponsor of AFP, the Association of Fundraising Professionals. We are certified Women's Business Enterprise and a member of the Giving Institute, which houses the Giving USA Foundation, which publishes the report we're going to be speaking about today. If you'd like more information about Alford Group, you can check out our website, which is alford.com. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we reside. So I realize you are all calling in from across the country, but I'm going to acknowledge Chicago, Illinois, which is Alford Group's headquarters. Chicago is located on the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, also called this area home. The region has long been a center for Indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. A few quick logistics. The webinar today is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording via email within 24 hours, so around this time tomorrow. That will include the recording, the slides, and the resources that will be mentioned today. This webinar is approved for 1.5 CFRE credits for anyone seeking certification or recertification of their CFRE. When we conclude today's webinar, you'll be immediately prompted to complete a very short survey. We encourage you to give us your feedback. It's just a few questions and it'll really help us in our planning for future events. For today's 90-minute webinar, we are all in listen-only mode for the duration. However, as you all have found, the chat is open. So please introduce yourself, put in your one word. We hope that that's a place for comments and reactions throughout today's webinar. However, if you have a question for the panelists or presenters, please use the Q&A function instead of the chat. So there's a separate icon on your navigation bar that will open a window and you can type your question that goes directly to the panelists. And we will monitor those throughout the webinar and answer as many as we can at the conclusion of today's event. All right, with that, I want to introduce Brenda B. Asare, who is Alford Group's president and CEO. And Brenda's going to kick us off and walk us through the agenda for today's event.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. And again, hello and welcome to Giving USA 2025 Philanthropy in Uncertain Times. I'm Brenda Asare, President and CEO of Alford Group. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an African-American woman wearing black-rimmed glasses, an orange blazer with an orange scarf, and my background is a beige wall with a gray poster of pearls. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. We're gathered today for a truly pivotal moment for the nonprofit sector. While the Giving USA 2025 data provides a snapshot of giving in the past year, the current operating environment has shifted dramatically. It is precisely because of these uncertainties that this conversation is so crucial right now. Despite the growing complexities, this moment is also profoundly philanthropy inspiring. We have a clear opportunity to unlock greater generosity and foster resilience in the face of these challenges. To help us navigate this landscape, we've assembled an incredible panel of sector leaders. We are thrilled to have insights from John Palfrey with MacArthur Foundation, Laura Coy with William Blair, and Stephanie Ellis Smith with Phīla Engage Giving. They will share real-world insights into how giving patterns are evolving and how organizations can adapt to thrive in this new environment. Before we hear from our panel, I'm pleased to turn the program over to my Alford colleagues, Sharon Tiknis, Chief Client Experience Officer, and Lieve Hendren, Senior Consultant, who will provide an overview of key insights from the Giving USA 2025 report. Before they come onto screen, we have our first poll this afternoon. So our poll questions are, how was fundraising for your organization in 2024? A single choice. My organization raised more money than 2023. My organization raised less money than 2023. Or we raised about the same in 2024 as we did in 2023. Again, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to our time together a little bit later in the program. We have a lot to cover. I turn it over to Lieve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. We are truly excited and honored to be here and have everyone with us today. My name is Lieve Hendren. I use she, her pronouns, and my title is Senior Consultant. I'm a white woman with brown curly hair. I'm wearing a green dress today with a plant behind me.
And I'm Sharon Tiknis. I'm honored to serve as Alford Group's Chief Client Experience Officer. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman with short brown hair. I'm in my home office with a bookcase and a mirror behind me. And we're excited to jump into the results of our first poll. So let's see how the poll responses landed.
Oh, it's wonderful to see that 58% are sharing that their organization raised more money in 2024 than 2023. Isn't that encouraging, Sharon?
Absolutely. And as we jump into the report, I just want to start by acknowledging that we are in a very different world in 2025 than we were in 2024. In recent months, uncertainty has become the norm across the nonprofit sector. Amid so much volatility and unpredictability, nonprofit organizations, their staff and donors can become disheartened and disengaged. So we focus on this data to look for trends, to provide insight, to help us evolve our approach, and to make data-informed decisions. And the Giving USA report covers philanthropic giving trends with new 2024 data, and it's a big data project. It's the oldest and most comprehensive report on charitable giving in the United States. It's published by the Giving USA Foundation, which, as Lucinda mentioned, is part of the Giving Institute, which is comprised of national firms such as Alford Group. The report is researched and written by the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Appropriately, the report is funded through contributions from Giving Institute member firms and other donors. Alford Group has been a member of the Institute for over 40 years and a significant donor to this body of research. And we're especially proud that Brenda, our president and CEO, has served as the chair of the Giving Institute board for the past 2 years. And next, we want to make this report available to you. Reach out to us at info@alford.com, and we're happy to extend to our friends and family a 30% discount on the report, which comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes to meet your needs. So, Lieve, let's get into the numbers.
Thank you, Sharon. Let's take a look at these headlines from 2024. It was a banner year for philanthropy across the United States, with a sum total of $592.5 billion in philanthropy. And that was up from last year's $557.2 billion in 2023. This data around generosity is certainly worth celebrating. The total giving growth in 2024, as you can see here, also reflects the long-term average of an uptick in philanthropy this year, with that giving rate, that delta rate, being similar to a 40-year average growth at 6.3% increase in current dollars since 2022. That's also going to be a 3.3% increase when accounting for inflation-adjusted dollars. Now on the next slide, let's zoom out and take a look at the data in context. This chart illustrates growth in philanthropy over those last 40 years. And for the most recent decade, that's going to be 2015 to 2024, total growth is 20%. Really inspiring. As you read this chart, you see steady growth. There are a couple of downturns that are going to be highlighted in those orange bars. That illustrates recession years in the orange bars. And it's also worth considering how America's wealth gap may influence this data. So Federal Reserve data shows that the top 0.1% of wealth in the United States has increased from owning 10.7% of the nation's wealth in 2010 to owning 14% in 2024. Now, you might be wondering what else could be driving this growth. We have a couple of economic conditions that we're excited to share. So first, Americans had more in their pockets in 2024. That disposable personal income, meaning what's left after taxes, went up by 2.2%. The S&P 500 also had a blockbuster year, up 25%. And historically, when the market's up, giving tends to follow. Charitable giving also represented 2.3% of GDP, which is strong. And inflation cooled off a little bit to 2.9% this year, down from 4.1% in 23. And that means that your donors' dollars and your dollars are going a little bit farther.
So jumping into overall giving by source, you can see here that individual giving comprised 66%, the largest percentage of giving, followed by foundations at 19%. And foundations represent grants made by independent, family, community, and operating foundations. Giving by bequest totals 8% of total giving. And I'm adding a quick note here that estates with assets below $1 million amounted to $10.24 billion. So 22% of all bequest giving comes through these size estate commitments. And we want to encourage you to be in conversation with donors who are close to your organization about considering their giving through their estate assets. And then finally, giving by corporations represents 7% of total giving, which is the strongest recent term growth by corporations. And as Lieve noted, strong GDP and other financial indicators resulted in 2024's increase in pre-tax profits, leading to corporations having more assets to give. An additional note that research shows that a related trend of increased corporate matching gifts, so increased workplace giving, is also contributing to that increase in corporate giving. So finally, casting a broader lens on giving by individuals, we just want to point out a total of 83.5% at a minimum comes from combining family, foundations, bequests, and individual giving. So obviously, individuals truly driving philanthropic giving. We see in the headlines all the time about mega gifts, which in 2024 totaled $11.72 billion. These big gifts are, however, a small percentage of the individual giving. So just for a second, take a guess at what that might be. And the answer is less than 2%. So just to remember that we're grateful for the way that large gifts can have big impact, but also looking at our next slide, that when we see those big gifts, we also know that there's another trend, which unfortunately, dollars up and donors down. Individual participation in giving is declining. The latest data from the Fundraising Effectiveness Project shows that year to year, overall number of donors giving declined by 4.5%. However, we want to really focus in on small and mid-sized donors who give up to $5,000 annually, that group comprising 96.9% of the total of all individual giving. So we want to keep hyper-focused on this group of our base of donors and be sure that we're more personalized in our approach to donors who give at all levels and be focused on donor retention, making sure that we're really tracking our retention rates as part of our weekly, annual, quarterly board reports. So let's jump into our next question. We're eager to hear from all of you. What was the change in the number of donors who supported your organization in 24? Were there more donors, fewer donors than in 23, or about the same numbers in 24 and 23? If you'll
While we
quickly.
wait for the poll to close, Sharon, as people pop in their answers using the Zoom poll function, I just want to circle back to that statistic you shared of 96.9% of all individuals' gifts, again, coming in at 86.3% of the total pie, being driven by gifts at the 5,000 threshold and below, with only the 1.98% being driven by those mega gifts, even though they take a lot of spotlight in the headlines.
Yeah. So can we see our poll results? Here we go. Well, kind of down the middle. The majority had more donors in 24 than 23. Thankfully, fewer of you had fewer, and many of you were about the same, 23 and 24. So let's just focus on donor retention while we continue to build our base of support. Lieve, let's talk about where the money went.
Thank you, Sharon, and thanks to everyone for participating in our poll. So where did the giving go in 2024? Here's a quick tour of America's giving pie by recipient sectors. So religious groups received the largest share, coming in at 23% of all charitable dollars, followed by human services and education, each at 14%. Foundations and public society benefit groups took 11% apiece. Health causes received 10%, international affairs coming at 6%, and then arts and culture, as well as direct gifts to individuals, made up 4%. Finally, last but not least, environment and animals receiving 3%. Now, quickly, let's take a look at how that compares since 2022. I'm going to give you a moment to take a look on this slide at the changes to your sector over the last 2 years, meaning 2022 to 24. And you can see in the highlighted yellow cumulative change column over here on the right-hand side that those big swings were increases in international affairs at 11.6%, public society benefit at 99.9%, and health at 8.1%. So a lot of fascinating changes.
So we want to leave you with our some suggested calls to action and hope that you find the energy in this data that we have. And first, to invite you to communicate your scenario plan to your donors, address the impact of economic and political changes and uncertainty, which leads us to our next call to action. Lieve?
With market volatility back on the rise in 2025 after low volatility, low VIX in 2024, now is the perfect moment to step up your planned giving outreach. Bequests are a powerful way to provide stability for your organization, especially in uncertain times. I saw a lot of people writing at the start of the webinar in the chat about uncertainty. So share that with your donors.
And finally, today, July 14th, Bitcoin is hitting a 5-year high. There is a rise in donors donating cryptocurrency as an appreciated asset. So update your gift acceptance policy and prepare to accept it. And with that, Brenda, we turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sharon and Lieve, for laying the foundation for our discussion this afternoon. Our panel has been listening, and they're so eager to share their perspectives as we look ahead. So I'm going to start with Laura. So panelists, please come on screen. And Laura, we're going to start with you. Please introduce yourself and also share, how are you feeling about the current philanthropic outlook?
Wonderful. It's nice to see everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Laura Coy. I'm the head of philanthropy and sustainability at William Blair. My pronouns are she, her. My background, I'm actually wearing a tan blazer with a black shirt, and I have a beautiful faux background of our corporate headquarters, 46th conference floor. I would say how I'm feeling about things right now. I loved seeing the chat. I saw a lot of intrepidation. I saw a lot of cautious optimism. I'm going with the feeling of you have to know to grow. And it's a balance of that sense of optimism as well as equipping yourselves with the tools and resources to navigate these times.
Thank you so much, Laura, for joining us this afternoon. Stephanie.
Hi, thank you, Brenda. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. My name is Stephanie Ellis-Smith. I am the CEO of Phīla Engaged Giving, a philanthropic advisory firm based in Seattle and Chicago. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Black woman in a patterned dress with a background that is slightly blurred. I'm in an office with a bookshelf and a painting behind me. Thinking about this moment, there's a lot of opportunity when there's chaos, when there is uncertainty. And I think I feel a bit optimistic, yet at the same time, a bit challenged to help folks sort of navigate through this period to find those kernels of opportunity to take leaps forward. Sometimes I feel like when the chips have been thrown all up in the air and they haven't settled, we have this great chance to kind of do some things differently and be more creative. So that's where I'm coming from at this moment.
Thank you, Stephanie. John?
Thank you so much, Brenda. I really appreciate the chance to be with you all and to be a part of this at just a key moment, I think, for our sector. I am a white male of middle age. I have light brown hair, and I'm standing in my home office in Chicago, also unceded land of the Potawatomi, in front of a bookcase, and really glad to be with you all. I echo the sentiments. We should probably get into the details, but I think this is a time where we all have to be courageous. I'm a big believer that courage is contagious, and we need to make sure that we are building on that as a sector, and certainly as a large philanthropy. I think there's more that we can all do. So increasing our giving seems to me essential, and we and others are doing that. And I was glad to see some of the data suggesting, at least through 2024, that giving continues to grow and go up. Obviously, 2025 is a different matter than 2022 to 2024, which I suspect all of our audience members were thinking as they saw those data. So we should get into it. But anyway, that's just an opening point from my perspective.
Thank you so much, John. Well, we all just heard an overview of giving in America in the year 2025. Well, certainly we all have acknowledged that much has changed so far in 2025. So from your perspective, what are the biggest shifts in the philanthropic landscape so far this year? Laura, I'm going to come back to you to kick us off.
Yeah, thank you. I think that there's two big shifts. One is just the shift itself. Which, we've done a piece before at William Blair called Philanthropy in the Age of Disruption. I think we've retitled that Philanthropy in the Age of Constant Disruption. But like John mentioned, 2025 has already provided some seismic shifts in the field. And through that, one of the biggest shifts we've seen is just donors meeting the moment. So stepping up and figuring out the role that philanthropy is going to play in the funding gaps and opportunities that have been presented. I know you had the Bloomberg philanthropy donation to Johns Hopkins in one of the intro slides, but if you think about Bloomberg Philanthropy stepping up to help cover the U.S. contribution to the UN climate budget, we're seeing more and more donors trying to figure out, whether it be research, climate, education, food security, how they can meet the moment. And we'll talk a little bit about the marketplace of philanthropy later, because I think it's actually something that collectively we as advisors and funders can collaborate more closely with nonprofits on. But that's one. And there's pros and cons to that, right? Because that could be taking donors off their intended or stated mission. It could be episodic funding that they're providing during this time. The second thing, just in the backdrop of being a financial services firm, is a huge shift in wealth transfer. And how that's playing out philanthropically, Brenda, is really through generations encouraging the next generation to come on board and play a role in philanthropy. And again, some pros and cons there, because as you educate and empower the next generation to step up and lead, it takes time and education to empower and prepare that generation. So it all comes down to meeting the moment and activating capital. But those are the two biggest shifts that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and certainly we're going to talk a little bit more later on about the next gen and how to best engage them and what was activating their generosity. Stephanie, what are some of the shifts that you're seeing?
Yeah, this is a great question and a great question to kick off this conversation with. I'm seeing, I'd say maybe three big ones. One is this broad focus on donors thinking about funding issues, not necessarily specific genres, but broader issues, democracy, larger environment things. So therefore, giving is shifting not just to C3s, but to nonprofits, but as well as political giving, giving to individuals. Donors, I think, being more creative in how they're using capital to move the lever around the issues that they're caring about. So it's using not only their charitable dollars, but dollars in their personal portfolios, and giving outside of just sort of tax advantage giving. That's one thing we see quite a lot of. Also, the next gen as a group that is rising and taking up more space. Like you said, I won't get into that now because we are going to have a question that's dedicated exclusively to that. But I did want to highlight just how important that is. And that relates to Laura's comment about the wealth transfer and that it is actually happening now in this moment. And how that is affecting our sector and how we're thinking about giving, charitable giving, even generally, is hugely important. Maybe the last thing that I'll say, and this is just from my hat of working, our firm works exclusively with donors and families, and I'm also a trustee with the National Center for Family Philanthropy. And through those lenses, one of the things that I have really been picking up on a lot the past couple of years is how philanthropy itself as a field and the social sector broadly is increasingly in the spotlight. For all the reasons that we can guess why everyone is looking over at us, and that's the donors, those are the service providers. What are we going to be doing with this spotlight, and how are we using this platform that we have? What are the messages that we're putting out to broader society about the importance of giving and the importance of civil society and the social sector? I think that's a really big trend.
I love that, Stephanie, when we think about what are the opportunities despite the challenges in terms of the spotlight on this sector and the leading role that we can play in leading to sustainable solutions and addressing solutions in our country. John?
Brenda, thank you. It's a challenge going third after Laura and Stephanie because they answer the questions so well, but I'll try just to amplify a few things. One, picking up where Stephanie left off, I do think that the focus that has come from the national scene, if you will, and we can go into it as much as you want, that has suggested, for instance, increases in the excise tax on foundations, which we've avoided for the time being, but after a lot of effort, the potential nonprofit killer function around the 501c3 tax status, the executive orders around diversity, equity, inclusion, on and on, with this set of attacks for the first time on philanthropy and the charitable nonprofit sector in a generation, really. I mean, probably since Senator Grassley and others in the 05-ish range, there really hasn't been such a focus from a national perspective on what we're doing. I think that is both a real pain and something that we are having to focus on in a way that we would not otherwise or put resource to as a sector. It also, to Stephanie's point, provides an opportunity because there are people paying attention to us in a way that had not been before. So I do think seeing it in both of those ways, there is defense that needs to be played and is being played in a very different way than before. Again, we can get into it, but there is also the spotlight on us opportunity to say, why does the charitable sector matter? And when federal cuts or other state municipal cuts are happening to other programs. Why do we need to support generosity? Why do we need to support the charitable sector? Why do we need to give more and do more? And why the combination of those two things is implausible for any version of the America, at least I want to live in. If you're going to cut programs like Medicaid and all sorts of programs to all sorts of communities, and then also kneecap those who are trying to help do something about it, whether it's a family stepping up in a community or a charitable legacy foundation or community foundation or an organization, you can't do both of those. I guess you can, they're trying, but in any event, I think the point is to make the case for the importance of what we're doing in whatever the scenario is. That's a very big piece of the opportunity. And I do think you will are seeing more people being more vocal about it. Not everybody, but taking a different stance. And against that backdrop, increasing giving and doing some more flexible giving and reducing some of the restrictions on gifts. And all of those things are things that we in the foundation president sector anyway are talking about on a daily basis.
Yeah, John, why don't you keep going on that thought in terms of how foundations are responding and reacting. I mean, one of the things that I'm just so proud of is the initiative that MacArthur recently kicked off, the Set It at 6 initiatives. Could you talk more about that? What was the underpinnings and what is it that you would hope could be accomplished as an outcome of that initiative?
Sure. So Set It at 6 is really just a prompt to all of us in the field to give more money and to say that the 5% IRS requirement from a foundation like ours is a floor, not a ceiling. And in fact, 6% should be a floor, not a ceiling. 10% should be a floor, not a ceiling, whatever you believe you can do. And noting that people are going to be in different positions, families are in different positions, markets go up and down, all those things. But the point is we can all do more, no matter who we are. So whether that's Brenda, Laura, Stephanie, John, out of our own pocketbooks, we can do more and should do more. Whether it's a family that has inherited a lot of wealth or made a lot of wealth, you can do more. Community foundations, you can raise more and do more. Legacy foundations, you can do more. There's nothing saying to us that we can't do that. There is a crisis. We need to do more, and really getting a conversation going about that. And I think we have seen some results. We have seen a few foundations saying they're going to spend down, which I think is one great answer. We've seen some foundations say they'll spend down more quickly. So Gates most famously saying instead of 25 plus years, they're going to spend down in 20 years. That just increases, obviously from a very, very, very large foundation, what's going out and so forth. So can I predict that 2025 will have another up year in giving? I can't, but I'd love to see it be a big up year. And I feel like many of us are really trying to push more dollars out the door. And then, that's sort of what you can see above the surface. But we also are ducks kicking pretty hard under the surface too, and organizing as philanthropies in ways that we really haven't in anybody's lifetime. And I think there's something positive in that too. But the main thing is just do more. And I'm calling it, Set It at 6 for us at MacArthur, but it really is give more, do more, and then ask less of others. And I think both of those two things are very much in the air right now in big organized philanthropy anyway.
Yeah, thank you, John. I want to stick with the conversation relative to organizations sunsetting early. So I want to talk a little bit about Gates and the impact. I mean, it's great that we're going to have more money coming sooner, but what are some of the longer term implications of major foundations sunsetting within that time frame? What's our hope as we look at some of these persistent issues that will require funding beyond a 20-year time period? Who would like to just give their perspective on the impact of that? And then Stephanie, I know you have some comments and some thoughts relative to what is it signaling to other family foundations as well in terms of inspired philanthropy.
Sure. I think the Gates example as an example is an important one because not only do we have what's now, it used to be a family foundation, but now an institutional foundation, setting this sort of new spend down directive. Not only are they inspirational, I think, for just a lot of other general foundations, but importantly, there is a whole group of people that are tagged on to the foundation within the Giving Pledge who are looking at Bill, his former wife, Melinda, at how they are spending their money, thinking about their giving. So there's a hope that there is knockoff effects of their leadership in funding those the initiatives that they're funding, and how they're actually doing it. And I want to make an important point too about this sort of idea of spend down. We think of it a lot in terms of the institutional philanthropy at MacArthur's and others, which is hugely important, and this sort of endowment spending. But in my world, there are two ways that we see that our donors and people that we're working with do that. Not only is it with if they have a private foundation that they are a part of, or they have a donor advised fund that they're using, they're also thinking about spending down of personal assets. There are two lines of spending down. And I think one of the things that we're thinking about, and this relates to the tax bill that has come up that everyone is talking about, it has prompted a lot of reflective conversations that we have been privileged to be a part of behind the scenes with our donors, their tax advisors, their estate planning attorneys, and their children. How much do we actually need?
Mm-hmm.
What is actually excess? And these are conversations that aren't just about the charitable giving and the foundation and the DAF. This is now all the rest of the stuff, the quote 95%, the rest of it. How are we going to make decisions about this? So I think that's something that has been more in the fore, at least in my world. And I see this through also the NCFP, the National Center for Family Philanthropy, and some of those conversations. And so I'll just maybe stop there and share this time with Laura, because I'm imagining you see some of that as well.
No, I just to pick up on that, I think that the other 95%, right? So let's just use John's 5% minimum distribution requirement for a second. Like there's 5% that is the floor, not the ceiling, that has to go out, but there's the other 95%. Stephanie, I think you're right on there, and just getting more creative around that capital. I mean, I would just mention two other things, return the returns, right? So as a foundation, even if you think about post-COVID current state, as horrible as the state of the world might look, the markets have performed. So if you're managing to a 5% minimum distribution requirement, yet the returns on your portfolio have been 10 or 12%, I think that goes back to the notion of being more planful and considerate about that. What do you need, right? If you just return your returns, you would maintain the level of your corpus for your philanthropy over time. That's not even a spend down, but that could potentially double the amount of grant making that funders can provide. Along that note, on the planned giving note, Brenda, too, I think, being more considerate around when we talk about wealth transfer, we're not just talking about a donation from a donor advised fund. You can actually make a public charity the beneficiary of your donor advised fund. So you might be amassing wealth in these vehicles, but you can also transfer that wealth. You can use that wealth in very meaningful ways that aren't maybe the normal ways that people have been thinking about transferring a donor advised fund from a family member to an heir. Nonprofits are social enterprises. They are also beneficiaries of philanthropic capital. So just dovetailing, thank you, Stephanie, just dovetailing a little bit on your great comments.
Laura, in terms of donor advised funds, there's still a lot of mystery about donor advised funds. How do you tap into it? How do you access it? What are your thoughts in terms of the opportunity, though, for nonprofits to still be able to benefit? Because I mean, what percentage of donor advised funds actually maybe don't have a beneficiary listed?
Yeah, it's a high percentage. We've seen up to 20% of donor advised funds not having beneficiaries because they're usually established pretty quickly. From our perspective, perhaps, it might have been a family who's gone through liquidity and they're looking to optimize their tax strategy in a given calendar year, and they open up a donor advised fund pretty quickly to receive a maximum tax deductibility, and then they're going to set the strategy for their fundraising or their grant making after that. So they might miss a step, right? So it's just making sure, and if you're having conversations with, because I view donor advised funds as individuals. Donor advised fund is a vessel. You're really working with individuals, and they probably at the high net worth level they might have a foundation and a donor advised fund, and they're giving directly. I love Stephanie's point around even just, eradicating this notion of tax efficiencies in order to make impact. But you're really working with an individual and having conversations with them around the types of ways that they can make a difference, including, if you have a donor advised fund, have you thought about leaving our charity or a variety of charities that you care about as a beneficiary of your donor advised fund? That could unlock an enormous amount of capital.
Laura, we've been talking a lot about individuals, and I certainly don't want us to forget about the everyday donors. I'm not going to ask you a question about that, but I do want to turn our attention right now to corporate giving, which again, we celebrate the 7%. Traditionally, we've seen 5% of all philanthropy coming from corporate, and now we're celebrating, we continue to see increased giving from that particular area. So with your finger on the pulse of corporate engagement across the globe, because I know you're an international organization, how are corporations thinking about philanthropy, and how do you see engagement shifting or adapting in this new environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it was so wonderful to see that number go up. There's a lot of questions, I think, we can talk about the bill later, but, kind of where corporations should be or where they'll fall given some of the changes. The biggest shift that we have seen over the past few years has been more so around the human capital space. And again, I'm kind of bleeding the lines a little bit of, the buckets of corporate and individuals and foundations, but more and more companies really looking to their employees as the inspiration for their giving, and their employees as involved leaders in the process of determining where corporate dollars go. So a lot of corporations tend to have focus areas and RFP processes, and it can be very frustrating, right? Because you've got to kind of fit the mold to each corporation and figure out what their process is. But more and more companies are really looking at their human capital, both from a dollar deployment perspective, but as well as a skills-based perspective. So are their employees, are their colleagues empowered and engaged? At William Blair, for instance, we have and I've seen a trend in this element of employee-inspired philanthropy, an amazing board program. So we don't just match our dollars for employees who give, we have a higher match for employees who serve on boards because we want them out in the community. We want them leading. And that's not just governing boards, that's auxiliary boards, advisory boards, committees. So human capital is probably, and I think you're going to see this trend continue just as the labor markets move. But the employee engagement component of philanthropy in corporate America is huge.
Thank you.
Brenda,
Stephanie, did you have something to add, Stephanie?
I wanted to ask if I could maybe jump off piste a little bit. This is not in our script, but I'm curious, Laura, as you were talking about the corporate giving, there's a, and I may have this wrong, but I understand that there's now this new corporate deduction at 1% for corporations. And there has been a little bit of back and forth that I've kind of been reading about, well, what does that going to mean now for corporate giving if the deduction minimum is 1% of some sort of corpus? Would you expect there to be less corporate giving now that there's kind of some restrictions on that? Or do you think that, that will spur folks to kind of give more? I was just sort of curious if you had any comments on that. And I'm sorry for Brenda.
No.
This is a conversation
on your questions.
Well, if you think about it, I mean, the last kind of big overhaul tax code from a corporate perspective was probably 86, right? 1986, where you probably saw a lot of corporate foundations becoming incorporated. And at that time, I believe corporate giving averaged as much as a 2% of businesses' pre-tax net income. We've actually gone down, Stephanie, to about 1% of pre-tax net income on average, like corporations. So the CECP, the Committee for Encouraging Corporate Philanthropy, puts out a great benchmarking study in October, so we can get that out to everybody. About 200 to 300 companies participate, and you can kind of see where different sectors and sizes of companies fall into play. But I think that's a really good question. I might argue, given we used to be at a 2% of pre-tax net income, and now we're down to 1%, even though that 7% in Giving USA is higher. I'm hopeful that this might be some incentive for corporations to be more planful around their philanthropy to reach because the floor to even get a tax deduction is 1% now. So you can't even get it unless you go over that. So I'm hopeful that that incentive is great. But I do think you might see things like corporations who are giving direct, corporations who are giving into their foundation, corporations who might also stand up donor advised funds to try to meet that threshold. What you might get is somewhat of a bottleneck, which I think we see across the board, where people are funding donor advised funds for the tax deduction, and then it's kind of sitting there, right? So it goes back to that notion of activating capital, but I'm hopeful that will get us back up towards higher pre-tax net income numbers over time.
You know, John, Stephanie mentioned some of the funding shift that she's seeing with her families. And one that she mentioned was pro-democracy collaborative. Could you talk more about your work in that area and what is the strategic focus behind some of those initiatives?
Of course, Brenda, thank you. And I do think that funding in the democracy space is one that has historically been a little bit feast or famine, as you probably know, been organized around election cycles. And one of the hopes and desires for those of us who work broadly in that space, and I define it very broadly, we can come back to that too, is to make sure that it's more consistent and that organizations don't have to kind of staff up and down. You know, one of the areas that we've worked in extensively may not sound like democracy off the bat, but is an essential pillar of it, is funding local news, as an example, where about a quarter of America right now are communities that do not have a local news provider. Nobody's covering the town meeting or the town council or city council. Nobody's covering the school board meetings because the newspaper business has failed, because television and other things have focused elsewhere. So there are, and a couple of years ago, we started something called Press Forward, which was an effort to revitalize and to fund local news. We started out with 3 large philanthropies: Democracy Fund, Knight Foundation, MacArthur Foundation. It's now 109 donors, organizations ranging from individuals through to big foundations with 41 local chapters. That's grown very, very quickly. And lots of people in that 109 have never funded anything related to democracy before, much less local news. It's a bit of a sell. You have to convince people that this is important to communities, it's important to your community, or it's important to our national democracy. But I think that's one example of ways in which there is growth there. You know, I will say that just in the spirit of real talk, there are people who are fearful about funding anything that might be perceived as being political, particularly in an era where there's retribution from the federal government directly on individuals or organizations. And so, you know, as I and others have been trying to do more, let's call it fundraising in the area of democracy, that there are some who are like, not for us right now, particularly those who have big business interests, for instance, with the federal government. Others are saying this is the most important thing, we have to do it. So I do think that it's a theme we're getting at here, is there's shifting underway, right? There's shifting in terms of who's doing what. And I think if you were on the side of seeking money, particularly for democracy, I think this is probably a very busy time, as some people may be shifting out of being good donors for you because it's too hot, but others are becoming possibilities. And, you know, often they are quietly coming to somebody like me who's not going to ask them for money, but who is, you know, advising. So there's a lot, I would say, much more. Will you come and talk to our board about this? Will you come and talk to us about the kinds of things you can do, that you can fund, that are fully nonpartisan, but might help support the republic? There's a lot of that right now, I would say. And I think there's a possibility in that for sure.
Thank you, John. And, you know, when we think about topics that may be too hot and that may place organizations in front in terms of a target, I'd like to just touch a little bit on some of the recent executive orders that has significantly impacted DEI initiatives and government funding, which we all know have created ripple effects across our sector. From your perspective, I'm asking each one of you, from your perspectives, how are these executive actions shaping the priorities, risk appetite, and even the very mission of nonprofits and their funders? Because we're seeing a lot, you know, Laura, on the corporate side, we're seeing shifts with CSR. Folks aren't really clear on what door they should be knocking on. Corporations, we've seen some, you know, action on the front in terms of some corporations being boycotted because of their stance. So I'd love to get each of your perspectives on the impact of these the DEI initiatives and how it's under attack in this moment. So, Stephanie, why don't I start with you?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for asking this question. I feel like the news cycle and everything that has been happening and everything that we've experienced since January 20th has moved so fast. Those February first rounds of EOs seem like a year ago, and it's only been, what, 5 months or 6 months. But they are still front and center, I think, in the minds of a lot of folks that we deal with, but in very different ways. Let me just say, we oftentimes we have convenings of family CEOs, family foundation CEOs, and others. And there, to your point, John, there's been a lot of curiosity and excitement, dare I say, around learning about how they can, quote unquote, lawyer up and decide, like, how can we just face these things head on? Because whether folks had, whether there were families or family boards who were either gung-ho about their focus on DEI,
Yes.
or some folks were maybe a little shy, the idea of the federal government coming in and saying, you can't do this, or we will be penalizing you for funding these types of organizations or initiatives, I have seen have galvanized folks into kind of a bit of a happy state of defiance. I think a lot of folks are thinking strategically about how they're going to do their giving. We have always, as a firm, we've always taken the stance of discouraging any of our clients from anonymous giving. It's not something that we've stood behind just as a principle. I mean, there are, of course, times when that's fine, but I think in these past few months, we've kind of loosened that up a bit, that if folks are feeling like, I want to double down and triple, double, quadruple my giving to this particular type of issue that is now in the crosshairs, but I'm going to go on an anonymous route, more power to you. We'll help them do that, because I think the idea that we can continue to fund where our values are is a key component of civil society and our sector. We cannot be dictated on those types of initiatives from the outside, particularly when you feel like you're being bullied over that. So I guess I would just say there's this idea of funding for advocacy, and learning about, like, what are the limits and what are the parameters that we can put, how far can we push to make sure that we can still do everything that we've already done, and ideally more in this particular climate. So we have brought in attorneys to family board meetings to kind of help them sort of figure out, like, what is their potential appetite for risk, essentially, so that they can kind of keep going on this same track and actually be leaders with other families.
Fantastic. Laura?
Yeah, I would just, just taking kind of a sliver of the opportunity, because I think there's the reaction of frustration, but then there's the reality, like even just looking at like entrepreneurship. So like between 2019 and 2023, Black women business owners increased their revenue by 32.7%. Latina women business owners increased theirs by 17.1%, yet a fraction of capital goes and invests in female and emerging entrepreneurs. So like this isn't adding up, right? Like, no, we're not going to argue about the profitability of businesses that need more access to capital. So exactly what Stephanie said, like, we're going to continue to invest and even invest further into initiatives that are going to provide access to capital and also generate capital for first generation income earners. So this is an opportunity to double down. I think, you can be faced with the intimidation of it all, but you can also take a step back and look at it from a practical approach at the return on investment. And that is something that we feel very strongly about. And we do have some wonderful programs like the Capital Collective that are doing just that. We're really targeting and helping first generation income earners and providing access to capital for emerging entrepreneurs. And yeah, the word diversity might not be in that program, right? But absolutely, that is what we're investing in and that's what we're promoting, and the numbers speak for themselves.
Happy to hear that. John?
These are such good things to hear about, both from Laura and Stephanie, and I agree totally. You know, top line, there is a risk of a chilling effect, no question. And I'm sure there are fundraisers on this call or nonprofits who are experiencing, you know, concern when they go with a program that has diversity, equity, inclusion anywhere in it. So I want to say that as the real talk. I am sure that that is so, just as I'm sure that there is a chill on the democracy front, or you know, some people who are pulling back their giving. And I think, as you both have said, there are, and I can speak really for the peers that I'm closest to, you know, I don't know anybody who's not funding diversity work, who are leading, you know, big foundations that have been doing that, or families that I talk to, or community foundations. They are finding one of two ways to do it. And I think Laura said it effectively on one, and Stephanie said it effectively on the second. There is a way, of course, to use proxies of various sorts and to be funding work that affects the same population that we're aiming for in a positive way without using those words. And there are versions of that that we understand, you know, there are good reasons for some people to do, and that absolutely is happening. And there are those of us, and I would put MacArthur squarely in the second category, that are saying, we looked at all of our diversity work, all of our equity work, all of our inclusion work. It is totally lawful, and we're still doing it. And I say this not as your lawyer. I am trained as a lawyer. I'm not saying it to give anybody else legal advice, but I feel completely confident that the way we are doing this work is totally lawful, and we're going to keep doing it. I do not believe in obeying in advance. I do not believe in capitulating when there are just threats, particularly when it's something that's a values or mission-based commitment. So that's where we are on this, and you know, we'll see. I know many of our colleagues are in the same position. Of course, everybody's hiring lawyers, bringing lawyers in, thinking about it seriously. All that is good and fine. I am likewise going to other people's boards and having that same conversation on how we're taking this approach. So I think either of those may be the right answer. But if you were committed to a multiracial, fairer version of America, et cetera, that I think many of us have hopefully gotten ourselves hoarse saying, we got to keep at it, we got to keep doing it. And of course it's lawful. The executive order, just to go back, Brenda, to your original question, that was passed on, or issued, I guess is the word, on January 21st, it said that the federal government is going to come back at us 120 days later, right, which was May the 21st, which came and went. I am now not trying to summon anything, but it is interesting to me that the each of the agencies that was meant to do that for 9 organizations, which could have included foundations of over 500 million or greater, or nonprofits, you know, on those lists, that has not yet come. So there are many of us who might well, you know, let's just put it broadly, be in the universe that could be subject to that, given the types of work we're due, you know, who are waiting. And is that a sort of Damocles over us? Of course, that's the feeling, right, that it was intended. On the other hand, it is also important to note that to bring something against a totally private actor, let's just call it anybody in the nonprofit charitable space, for doing, again, what we do that in my view is completely lawful on the diversity front. I think that's one of the reasons we didn't see something on May the 22nd. It wasn't as easy as just saying diversity work is unlawful, because much of what we do, whether, you know, in all sorts of ways, from hiring to investing to giving, it fits in the First Amendment. And there is a freedom to give, there is a freedom to invest, there is a freedom to hire the people that you think are best for the job. And things like lived experience are relevant for that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, I'm obviously on a soapbox here. And I think it is really important that we recognize and we stand up for the things that are totally lawful and keep doing them.
Exactly. You can hear the snapping going on and the mic dropping over this question. Stephanie, I want to come back to you and Laura on something. Laura, in one of your opening remarks, you made a reference to seeing in this moment where donors are stepping up. Certainly, as we look back to the pandemic, and without question, the largest donor was Mackenzie Scott, right? She stepped into this. And so I would love to get your perspective on, we're not seeing as visible, and I know it's probably happening behind the scenes, and you alluded to one in terms of Bloomberg, but what are we seeing in terms of individual donors stepping up to meet this moment? And then Stephanie, I'd like for you to then kind of talk through some findings from a report by the National Center for Family Philanthropy that really highlighted the growing complexity of giving that's experienced by philanthropists. So Laura, starting with you, meeting the moment. Stephanie, the complexity of giving that we all need to be well aware of.
Great. And I'm going to frame mine a little bit, Brenda, as both
Okay.
observations and advice.
Okay.
Because I do think as funders, we have been gathering to talk about meeting the moment. So where's the marketplace right now for philanthropy? When we talk about research cuts, where is the collective case for support around the need in a compelling way? We've been doing a lot one-off, and I'm really proud of our clients who are stepping up, who are saying, you know what, we want to eradicate an orphan disease that has lost its federal funding. I'm going to double down. We have a client who has quadrupled their funding of a rare disease that has seen significant cuts in research. I couple that with this advice around articulating impact, because the reason that individual is so compelled to meet the moment is they can actually see the impact. They can actually see that their dollars are being invested in. And we understand research, 99.9% of it has to fail for something to move forward. But to create that marketplace for that funder to understand, you know, if you triple or quadruple your funding, here's what that's going to enable our organization amongst the backdrop of the deficit that we're now working on to eradicate this disease. So that's what we're seeing. We are seeing grassroots donors on the ground working hand in hand with organizations to figure out how to solve some gnarly problems that existed before the budget cuts, but now are hugely escalated because of them. So the marketplace is huge. We want to do more work. We want to do more collaborative work in this space with other grant makers to help that escalation and the time of ideation to grant. And then also the impact piece, which I know when we talk about Next Gen is huge, right? Like seeing the impact, building the relationships and showing it. But I use that one example as you know, one of many clients that we work with that has said, you know what, I'm not going to wait. This is something that is curable. This is something that is now up against deficit. These are people's lives in you know, in the balance. And I have the resources, like Stephanie said, I have the privilege to make a difference. I'm just going to do it.
Thank you, Laura. Stephanie, what are the complexities to all of this?
Well, as you referred to, there is a study that came out from the NCFP, National Center for Family Philanthropy, on barriers that many donors, individual donors, sometimes face to giving, and they highlight 10, I believe. Some of them are, you know, the tasks that are required, you know, the compliance. There are too many choices. As far as nonprofits, there's a fear of failure for a lot of folks, of, you know, making the wrong choice. Some people on the complete opposite end of the spectrum may have a lack of urgency. In this day and age, John and others, we talked about it, there is a fear of being targeted or public scrutiny, which has always been there, but I think now, particularly in this moment that we're in, paired with social media, that sometimes gives people pause, and that for folks, many of them are perfectionists. I call it sometimes analysis paralysis, that they have to learn so much before they can make a really good decision. And we know how that happens. It just kind of keeps going on. And the next thing you know, a year or 2 years have gone by and nothing has happened.
Right.
Those are just 5 of a list of barriers that you can find in that report. Thank you, Lucinda, for putting that in the chat. And so I guess I would say, from our perspective as philanthropic advisors, I see our job is essentially trying to diminish and mitigate these barriers as much as possible, to keep capital flowing as quickly as possible and as broadly as possible throughout the sector. And then I think as far as our audience and the development professionals and the fundraisers on this call, is the focus maybe for you all, and maybe what I would say you could take from this, is understanding that there are real issues sometimes that are going on behind the scenes with donors and with your givers. They're people too. They are also worried about family members who are affected by the lack of funding for Medicaid. They are perhaps taking care of kids and also taking care of elders in their family. They're in the sandwich generation. There's all of the worries, I think, that all of us have, are also on top of our donors as well. And many of them, the vast majority, whether they're well, we looked at that 96% number of most of our donors. They're not professional philanthropists. They're not institutions. These are families who are trying to make decisions together. I think the more that fundraisers and development folks understand that and kind of lean in with a little bit of that empathy, and it's a hard balance, I think, to manage urgency and patience at the same time. But this is kind of where we're at. I think a lot of folks are just trying to navigate this moment as best they can. And for all of us who are behind the scenes with these families, whether you're in fundraising or you're on the philanthropic advisory side, is helping to eliminate us barriers as much as possible so that they can make the gifts. And just to kind of keep a gentle, hands at their back, to kind of keep things moving and to keep things going, because it can be overwhelming. And I think the overwhelm is real, particularly if you're not staffed. Many of our families, we have some families who have a philanthropic staff, small, not the size of our larger giving institutions, but they may have up to maybe 5 people working with them, but you're still have a bottleneck between a mom and dad, a grandparent who wants to sort of chime in on something. Maybe the gift is all teed up and ready to go, and then a grandparent comes in who has another question or something. There's just a lot of machinations that are going on behind there that we try to alleviate. But I think for fundraisers is really trying to understand how you can help and, like I say, just alleviate some of these burdens so that things can kind of keep moving. And it's
Try to make it frictionless.
Try to make it frictionless, exactly. And I know,
Yes.
and I totally understand it's easier said than done, but there's the magic, I think, that comes in the world of development. And as a former fundraiser myself, one of the people who have loved fundraising, that is a challenge that I really enjoyed. And so I hope folks do enjoy that challenge, because we are definitely here with it.
Right. Laura, did you have something to add?
No, I think it's
Okay.
great. And I do think the next generation is a little bit different than their parents, right? So as advisors, we're also in the weeds of that not just the wealth transfer, but we're education transfer, knowledge transfer. Sometimes the generation that is now taking the helm to give, it was their grandparents who inspired the philanthropic wealth, and they're not even close to the purpose or inception. And in some instances, that generation doesn't feel entitled to it. So that the psychological barriers to giving and overcoming that's real. And Stephanie, thank you. Thank you for sharing it from that perspective.
John, as we think about, foundations, and again, we just so appreciate your leadership in the sector and encouraging other foundations to do more, give more, and even to call out to all of us, because we all are philanthropists. I would love to just get your perspective. What are you seeing in terms of foundations in general? I know, during COVID and the pandemic, we had trust-based philanthropy. We had making it easier for grantees to apply, not having rigorous requirements around reporting. What are you seeing in terms of the foundation landscape that is either similar or different from what we experienced during COVID and the intentionality of that part of our sector?
Thank you, Brenda, for that kind invitation to reflect on these two crises. And somebody might put in the chat, a bunch of us did a Stanford Social Innovation Review series that's now out online, freely available, which reflects on exactly that, what we learned in COVID, what we're doing now, what this might mean for the next crisis, which there will be one. Anyway, I got a diverse set of people to write reactions, which may be of interest. I won't put it in the chat because I'm speaking to you now, but maybe somebody can find it. In any event, I think a couple of things. One is, COVID was a natural crisis. This one's man-made. I said it advisedly. There are differences, and there obviously is a degree of instability associated with this one that may or may not play out differently. I think the COVID experience, of course, corresponded with the tragic murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning period that came with that. And so I think that affected, of course, the diversity work we were all doing and led to, at that time, a positive spread of additional funding on that score. We do not have that now. Obviously, the dynamic is quite different. on that score. So there are differences, but the similarities, I think, are quite important because each of the things that you just mentioned, Brenda, I think are continuing, which is we can come back to whether or not there's more money actually going out the door. I hope there will prove to be, but that will be in the 990s and then the effect of what people are able to raise. And I think, there's some concern that a few names are out there over and over again as the ones spending more. I think that there is a lot below the tip of that iceberg that people are not saying it, but are going to do it. So I do believe that I will advisedly say that I think there will be more in 2025 because of positive markets as well as the need to spend more. But I realize that's, show don't tell on that score.
Right.
I think all those other things you described are happening. And I do think that there is more general operating funding and, the Council on Effective Philanthropy, CEP, Center for Effective Philanthropy studies that I know. I do think the Mackenzie-Scott effect that organizations, of course, they can handle unrestricted large amounts of money. Of course they can. We know that well proved, I think, through research. Again, on the asking less side, I was saying do more, ask less. What we're trying to do, for general operating, we basically have what we call Gen Op, no app. So we don't have an application for general operating. We try to renew where we can over a long period of time. We've tried to reduce the reporting requirements, not to zero. We have to have some appropriate diligence and parameters, but trying to reduce the ridiculous constraints. A number of us are working on something called the Philanthropy Data Commons, which would create a data set that then could have a common application. It seems amazing to me that colleges, universities, even high schools can have a common app, and yet we are so special in philanthropy, we can't pull that off. We did a study showing that 40% of what we collect across big philanthropy is all the same. At least why don't we just collect the 40% once or get it off of Candid and whatever and move along. Like there's a lot more that we could do that we're not doing. And so I think there's a fair amount of that kind of thing that, it's of course we could do those things if we invested some in it, and then the cost savings, the time savings would go on. The only thing I would just put back that may be helpful to those who are seeking funding, just to sort of also the honest and reality check, real talk, is that particularly during this time, those of us who've said we're going to spend more money, we have a lot more inbound. So, for MacArthur Foundation, we do about 400 grants a year in the US, in India, in Nigeria. We are well aware there are about 1.5 million nonprofits in the US, more in Nigeria, more in India. We can't quite handle all of the people who would like a grant from MacArthur Foundation, put it that way, even in the areas that we're in. And I do think that there has been a fair amount of, appropriately more asking. And we do study this, and we do try to get back to everybody and so forth. But I think just understanding that even in the big philanthropies, we have about 200 staff, or Stephanie's mentioning the people with 5 staff or individuals. There's a lot more coming our way. And so just recognizing the human element on the other side. And like Stephanie, I was raising money for 18 or 20 years for nonprofits before I was giving it away. I've done much more of that. I get it, and you need it and all the rest, but also just recognizing there's a person on the other side who is trying to answer all their emails as well as they can and all their voicemails, and the flow of need is up. So.
Thank you, John. Several times we've mentioned the wealth transfer. And before we wrap up our time, 2 more things. I would like for us just to touch on the next gen. What makes them different from their parents, grandparents, and how should we be interacting with next gen philanthropists? So Stephanie, you want to open us up, and then Laura.
Sure. I guess I would just maybe kick off that question by stating the obvious, and that next gen younger donors are not younger versions of just previous generations. I mean, I think we all know this. They are shaped by fundamentally different experiences, economic precarity, climate change, 2020 and everything that came into that, social media. So as a result of all of that, how they make decisions are fundamentally different. They're values driven, impact oriented. These are, and I just want to say some of these things are a bit cliched, but I think there's a huge element of truth in all of them. The skepticism around larger institutions, large opaque organizations, I think are just less interesting. I think there's a greater preference for transparency, storytelling, evidence. There's a much more focus on community and peer influence. I think collective giving and relying on networks is much more of a interesting focus, I think, for younger donors. And then also the broader integration of their financial lives. I kind of mentioned this before. but that they don't always see this hard line between investing, spending, giving. Many of those types of things are blurred, and it's the blurring is a values-driven approach, values-driven
Mm,
investments around, ESG, impact investing, spending in places where they want to advance either that business owner or a particular neighborhood, which ties directly to their giving. And I definitely don't want to leave out mutual aid. That is another really big focus that I see Next Gen leading into. And so approaching them differently, absolutely, but not just because they're younger, but really focusing and approaching them based on values and values-driven
mm,
partners. And and maybe some just some practical tips and thinking about how to actually do that, realizing that it does take some effort and some financial investment. So I don't want to alienate smaller nonprofits here, but to the extent that you can, segmenting your audience, trying to avoid a bit of that one size fits all campaigns if possible. Prioritize community building, getting younger donors to connect with each other and peers around your cause and your issues, and connecting with your employees. Being super clear about your problem. That's like showing the why and the how, your approach, because they are evidence based. They do want to see that. Um, Brenda, I had to just sort of chuckle a little bit thinking about crypto, which I have to say does not kind of factor into my thinking. But
all of your clients aren't doing crypto, Stephanie?
so far we don't have any. But that's just us. Crowdfunding, DAF, cryptos, skills-based volunteering, non-traditional ways of giving, and being
Ah,
creative of
mm-hmm.
how you offer opportunities for them to be involved and connect with your organization financially and non-financially, I think is important. And then lastly, kind of related to this diversity DEI conversation that we had earlier, investing in your own staff and your own DEI. Younger donors, they notice who's leading. They
Mhm.
notice if there's only men or white leaders, and you're talking one way and your organization looks another way. They notice those types of things. And so they want to see how power is shared within your organization and that you think really strategically about equity. And then the last thing I'll just say is just be authentic with who you are and the depth of your impact in your communities, and substance over style. That matters. You don't need to chase trends. If you don't have a TikTok account, I'm not going to go out there and say you got to get TikTok if you want to raise money from Next Gen. Be authentic, and substance over flash.
Yes. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Laura?
You've said so much, Stephanie. I
Yeah.
would just, if I had to kind of hone in on a couple things. One is just experience. Like, I think sometimes the perception of Next Gen is they have all this access and experience, but like when you get them close to your mission, that matters. They care deeply. They care deeply, and they're smart. And I think they're going to revolutionize the way we give and how we give. Everything John said about making it easier, like they are not
Mhm.
bureaucratic. They want this, they want to see the impact, but just give them that experience. And then the secondly, like just give them the opportunity, engage them. Like, I've even seen clients sometimes be a little reticent on like, am I ready to go to this big event with lots of people? But they are ready to lead. Just because they're young doesn't mean they don't have the capacity to serve on an advisory board or a board. Like, get them engaged, bring them to the table, ask them what they think. So I think it's really about the experience and the engagement. And I'm so excited. I really think we're going to turn into, I think the statistics so far is that of the wealth transfer, already approximately 10% has been earmarked to nonprofits. And I know those numbers tend to
That's great.
move around, but of the 128 trillion,
Um,
about 12 of that is already earmarked towards philanthropy. So think about what this generation can do with the
yeah,
rest.
and again, the rest of those dollars are in the hands of women in the next gen, right? So when we in diverse communities. Laura, you talked about, as we think about the future and how exciting it is and will be, and we can make it be that way. I want us, before we wrap up our time and open up for some questions, when we look out and we think about, next 2 to 5 years, what are the seismic shifts in donor expectations in the sector technology or societal trends do we need to fundamentally reshape when we think about our sector? How should we be thinking about the future of our sector, the future of philanthropy? John?
Wow. Well, there's so much to it. We've covered so much great ground.
Yeah.
On the next gen point that I just wanted to raise is my experience with next gen individuals is there's also an increase in interest in impact investing and investing the corpus in more effective ways. And so I don't know if this is appealing to many people in the audience, but certainly those who could take a PRI or an MRI, think differently about your balance sheet, those kinds of things. I think there could be opportunity there. And I'm just in my travels, there's much more interest in that. As an aside, I'm president of the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, board, so that's partly where I come at it. But I do think that there's a huge unlock there, and to the point about money that's in not the 10% necessarily going out, but even if the 90% stays with people, if it's invested in ways that are actually helping balance sheets of more nonprofits or others, could be very powerful. So anyway, just a side note there that I think is so good. Back to your core question, Brenda. I mean, I think this has been averted to both in the chat and by my fellow panelists, but really it is ultimately about having an impact and inviting people into having an impact with you. Like, we all have boards, we all have goals of our own, and to the extent that in an authentic way, you can show that just do the work well and that you are doing the work well and it is affecting people's lives. It is affecting communities in the authentic ways that Stephanie mentioned, for instance, in her last comment. That's ultimately the right answer, right? And that's ultimately the right answer for our sector, is to be supporting those who are doing that work, as well as possible. And, I know there's a lot of discussion of saying, philanthropy should support people over 10 or 20 years and not for, 1 year. There's some truth in that, but we're not going to support you for 10 or 20 years if you're not getting the job done. Right. The organizations we do work with over those periods of time are ones that are really producing great, authentic results. And it's not necessarily about all these metrics, but, it is about the kinds of relationships with the communities, with funders, and to the extent that it's possible to be in the business of thinking in those long-term ways, as opposed to the sort of quarter-to-quarter approach, both for those giving and those doing the work. I think that's where we're going to be strongest.
Terrific. Laura?
I would just, the only thing I would add is, I do think there is a role for both artificial intelligence, AI, and always intuitive, right? So there's going to be this balance between harvesting tools and technology to find more donors, use data to figure out who might be good funders, but then just that authenticity is, that Stephanie mentioned, is so important, right? So there's going to be this, I think, nice tension between where nonprofits should spend their time in order to scale effectively, because I think giving is going to continue and escalate in its complexity. I encourage everybody, if you want to talk about planned giving, one trend that we saw this past year was, and I was curious on the bequest for Giving USA, like, did less people die? Are more people giving now? Is it a combination? Because we would view like a donation of a minimum distribution requirement from an IRA as a planned gift, right? That's not a bequest, but that's using a retirement vehicle to make a six-figure impact. And we saw a huge increase in RMDs from IRAs last year. So I think giving is also going to continue to become more and more complex. Families are going to use multiple vehicles. You're going to have more people at the table with people living longer. So, please reach out, educate yourselves, be as sophisticated as you can in understanding the different ways that, philanthropy can play a role. I think John brought up a great one around impact investing. It's going to continue. That trend should continue to grow, and it's huge, but continue to educate yourselves on all the ways that you can seek funds and the types of funds available, because it's going to continue to be and will be excitingly complex.
Yeah, we heard Stephanie allude to the variety of vehicles that her clients are using in terms of approaching philanthropy. Stephanie, what are some of the seismic shifts we should be paying attention to as we plan for the future?
Well, gosh, I think all of the above. I think we covered many of them in the call. I guess I just wanted to double down, if I could, just once more on this transparency and authenticity, to approach and to handle these seismic shifts that I think we kind of have named, but sharing challenges as well as successes that, you know, your organization is doing what they can to meet these unheard of and unprecedented times, I think is more important than ever. The days of shiny perfection are gone. You know, avoiding the polished, you know, annual report speak, you know, I think we got to throw some of that out the window right now. But gosh, to manage these shifts, I think one, and I guess I'm still focusing on managing the shifts, Brenda, because I feel like I would just be repeating myself if I was just sort of talking about the things that we've faced. But I want to just maybe throw out something kind of a little off the wall for folks to consider when you're thinking about like how to handle all of this, and like what does this mean that, you know, that there's a new day and everything is changing, and the level of uncertainty that we're all navigating, and how do we connect with our donors in a new way, in a meaningful way, particularly the younger ones. And I wonder if there's a way, and now is a time to go back on an old saw that in my fundraising days that you really kept donors at arm's length around programming and co-creating programming, and how they're giving feedback. And I wonder, I'm just sort of throwing out there something totally crazy, like what if now is a time to like get more in the weeds with donors and doing more co-creating type things. I mean, it's not anything that we have typically tried to do before, but if you're trying to engage and trying to meet a moment where everyone, I feel, is feeling like, what can I do? It doesn't feel like if I just gave $500 that that's enough. Maybe thinking creatively on the nonprofit side, maybe creating lanes for actual engagement around programming and sharing feedback. Maybe now's the time to explore that. I mean, again, like I'm just throwing something out there, kind of crazy, but
No.
we're just in a new time. And John, you were a former fundraiser too, so you probably remember those days when we're like, no, like this is our area, but maybe we just kind of throw the whole thing up and just say, you know, whatever, come
Well,
on in.
Stephanie, what I like about what you said that we've been focusing on, I feel like major gifts tends to be a big part of like how we think and feel, and like $500 makes a difference, right? Like and I think that's where, going back to the bill too, you're gonna potentially, are you gonna see more people giving less? You're gonna see less people giving more, but like the threshold of philanthropy, if you can get someone in the door at $500 who feels connected, they're going to give
Yes.
1,000, they're going to give 2,500. You know, that was, I joined the fundraiser club like that. You know, our moves management, Brenda taught me everything I know about fundraising. So,
Thank you, Laura.
you've got to cultivate it with that in mind, and make sure that the people who give $500 know that that matters.
That's right.
When
John?
Stephanie called on me as someone who had raised money in the past, and it was mostly for a school, and before that for a university research center that I was running. And you know, in both of those cases, while the old saw of if you want money, ask for advice, if you want advice, ask for money, the advice part wasn't always really accepted, right? And actually, Stephanie, your prompt is, what if you actually really listened for that advice? What if some of the people, maybe people you don't always agree with, have some ideas that might expand the work and might expand, I don't know. It is a slightly crazy idea, as you say. And I think those of us who have not had the, let's just say, the outcomes that we wanted for all of our programs, maybe being a little open to that and hearing from some donors, even if they, again, are not from the same, let's say, politics we have. I think it's a wonderful challenge, and no one's ever said that quite to me that way, but I think it's quite insightful.
Well, folks, we are at the end of our time, and it has just been wonderful being in community, in connection with all of you in the room, as well as our attendees this afternoon. While this landscape is certainly facing shifts, the insights today, I really feel, underscore a critical message of the importance of being adaptive and having strategic foresight. I love the idea of co-creating with our donors and partners. Then they own it, being authentic about who you are, what you do. And again, all of this foundationally relates back to our values. So again, I just want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We hope this conversation provides actionable strategies for all of you who are navigating these uncertain times. I'm going to ask Lucinda to come back on to close us up and let us know what's next. So again, thank you, Laura, Stephanie, and John, Sharon, and Lieve for participating in our program today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Lucinda?
Yeah, I cannot echo that enough. What an insightful and inspiring conversation. Thank you to the panelists and thank you to everyone who joined and thank you for your participation. The chat was on fire and we answered as many questions as we could frantically in the back for those of you who asked questions through the Q&A. So hopefully we were able to answer all of your questions. If we weren't, we want to continue the conversation. So you can find us at info@alford.com. Please feel free to drop us a note. And then finally, just 2 logistical items. You will receive an email from us tomorrow with a link to the full recording, the slides, a transcript, so you'll have all the good commentary, as well as links to the resources that were discussed here today. So we'll have that all in your inbox about this time tomorrow. And then finally, when we conclude here in just a second, you'll be immediately prompted to complete a very short survey. So it's really short, it's like 3 or 4 questions. We really, really appreciate your feedback for us to learn from and to produce future webinars as well. So again, thank you, Laura and John and Stephanie. Thank you, Brenda, for moderating such a wonderful discussion. Thanks to Lieve and Sharon for your presentation on Giving USA. We really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you all soon and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Lucinda. Always forward, everyone. All
That's
good
right.
things. Thank you.
Right. Take good care.